How's it going, everyone? I'm Dylan. This is All You Can Board, and it's time to look at Nova, which is the second Marvel Champions Hero Pack that released on the same day. We got Ironheart, which I already have a video up. You can click above to see that review if you haven't seen it yet. This is Nova, the second hero pack that we had released that same day. Also a Champions character. These are both Champions heroes, but they play very differently. So I'm not going to waste any time. I'm going to just jump right into this, and we're going to talk about all the cards and what I think of them. So, very first thing we're going to do is start off with the alter ego, of course, which is Sam Alexander. 3 recovery. Alter ego action here is spend 1 resource of any type, search your deck and discard pile for Supernova Helmet, add it to your hand, and put it into play instead if you paid for this ability using a wild resource. So, the thing I need to preface right now, in case you were not familiar with Nova, is that the entire mechanic, the gimmick, whatever you want to call it, that is going on with Nova is that he utilizes specifically wild resources. So, whenever you can spend wild resources, you're either going to get cards cheaper, you're going to get extra benefits, or in this case, like you see, you'll be able to get the helmet put directly into play instead of getting put into your hand, which is essentially as if you had it in your hand, you've now paid for it because the helmet costs 1. So as if you're paying for it with the wild resource, essentially with it not in your deck, you're essentially paying for it even though it's not in your hand and getting to put it directly into play, which means you're going to see a lot of Supernova's helmet. And even though that's the 15th card out of 15 for the hero cards, it's the card we're going to look at next after the hero side, just so you can get an idea of what you're going to have at your disposal with the helmet pretty much always being in play when you play Nova. His hit points are 10, his hand size is 6. Overall, decent alter ego side. Obviously, the most important thing here is just you're constantly being able to get the helmet. So if you ever lose the helmet at the start of the game when you don't have the helmet, you're using this action to primarily get that into play because it's a really, really big help for a lot of what Nova's doing to have that helmet in play. Going on to the hero side, we have Nova, 1 thwart, 1 attack, 2 defense, pretty low stat line, all things considered. But the response here is after you use one of Nova's basic powers, any of those 3, ready Supernova's helmet, or Supernova Helmet. So obviously, even though his stat line's low, you're getting extra uses out of the Supernova Helmet by just using any of the basic abilities, whether that be thwart, attack, or defense. So it kind of compensates for the stat line being low in that you're getting a bunch more mileage on cards you're able to play and things you're able to do specifically with Supernova Helmet, especially because of what it generates. And so we should probably just get right into Supernova Helmet so that you can understand the full context here. Supernova Helmet is a 1-cost upgrade. Nova gains the aerial trait, and hero resource exhausts Supernova Helmet to generate a wild resource. So again, because so much of what you're doing involves wild resources, having a permanent way to generate a wild resource, and specifically when you're in hero form, to essentially generate 2 wild resources as long as you're using one of the basic abilities, is a huge deal. You're going to be able to do a whole bunch of stuff that you normally wouldn't be able to do in terms of playing extra cards in your hand, but also getting cards at cheaper cost, as we'll see right away. And there's just a ton of uses for wild resources in general. So Supernova Helmet being a permanent fixture of this is super important. If this was a card that you had to just hope would come up, this would be a way less strong hero, way weaker hero. The fact that you can guarantee Supernova Helmet being out in play at the start of the game and have a consistent way to bring it back is a huge deal. So let's get into some of the cards that are in this pack so that you can start to see what you're going to be doing with these wild resources and you know what's possible. First up, we've got the Signature Ally, which is Miss Marvel, a 3 cost, 3 health, 1 thwart, 1 attack. Hero response, after you play an event, exhaust Miss Marvel and deal 1 damage to her, return that event to your hand. Phenomenal card. This is obviously playing off of the mechanics we've seen in the actual Miss Marvel hero pack. The fact that you're able to get these events directly back to your hand and she only has to take a single damage to do so means that I rarely, if ever, use the thwart and the attack values on Miss Marvel. To me, it was always way more beneficial to just have the damage that's going on to her be from her ability and getting these events back in your hand. If you are in a situation where you really need to do a single damage to take off like a tough status card, or you need 1 threat to remove to get rid of a nasty side scheme, sure, it's nice to have the flexibility to be able to do that, but in general, getting those events back directly to your hand is just too good. I mean, some of the events that Nova has are really, really good, and you might be discounting them for really cheap if you're using wild resources. To get them back and use them again this specific turn is a huge, huge deal. Awesome ally, I use it a bunch, and again, I use it specifically for her ability, and often, you know, when I had already dealt 2 damage to her, she's giving me 2 events back, then I blocked with her to sort of send her out on her way that way. All right, we've got 2 copies of Forcefield Projection. This is a 1-cost event. Hero interrupt. When a friendly character would deal any amount of damage from an attack, prevent 3 of that damage. If you paid for this card using a wild resource, deal 3 damage to an enemy. I don't know if I read that right. It's when a friendly character would take any amount of damage. I can't remember if I said deal any amount of damage. Take any amount of damage from an attack, prevent 3 of that damage. If you pay for this card using a wild resource, deal 3 damage to an enemy. So this is a really cheap way to obviously prevent 3 damage. I use it. I honestly didn't use it nearly as much as I thought I was going to do, and I don't really have a good reason for that aside from there was always just other things I wanted to do in my hand, or it was at a time where even though it's a cheap cost, that 2 cards that where I was going to lose because of doing this was going to make it so that I couldn't do something I wanted to do on my next turn upcoming. Whatever the case is, it's still a really good card. I mean, you're preventing 3 damage for 1, which especially on allies can be a huge deal if you're protecting ones that you still want to get mileage out of, like Miss Marvel, for instance. But on top of that, you have access to wild resources really frequently, and even if you use the helmet for this, you're able to ready the helmet again just by using one of Nova's abilities on the next turn. So dealing an additional 3 damage all for 1 cost is obviously really, really good. It's a hell of a package. It's just Nova does have a lot of these strong cards that are really cheap, so you want to hopefully be able to do a whole bunch of them and not have any of them slow you down. But there were times that I wanted to use this, but I thought, you know what, I could honestly take the 3 damage and have a full effective turn next turn without having to have lost a couple cards in my hand or 1 card in my hand, whatever the case may be. So I was often balancing that. But that being said, it still feels good when you use it. You're still going to get a lot of effect out of it. It might just not be the one that you're using the most out of all the cards that he comes with in his hero pack. Next up, we've got 3 copies of Lightspeed Flight, 2-cost event. Double the number of wild resources generated while paying for this card. Hero action, remove 3 threat from a scheme. So you might be thinking 3 threat for 2 is not very, that we've seen more for 2. We expect more for 2. Well, I never ever paid 2 for this, never once. I feel like if you're paying 2 for this, you're probably in a really dire strait with Nova, and that's something you want to fix more than it is paying for this card. Because he has such a strong access to wild resources with his helmet, and other cards you're likely building into the deck to just have natural wild resources on them, you should have a way to pay for this with a wild resource. And if you do, you'll have to pay 1 then, because it doubles the cost of them, or the how much it generates. So in that case, you're paying 1. It's 1 cost to do 3 threat removal, which at that point is really efficient, and it still allows you to do a lot more in your turn. You could have a couple of these in your hand and remove 6 threat, for instance. So you absolutely should not be paying 2 for this unless you are in such a pickle, such a dire strait that you absolutely have no better way to do anything on your turn. But in general, I never in any of my games once paid 2 for this. I was always able to pay 1, and it always felt really good to have that really quick, effective way to get rid of threat and still do a whole bunch of stuff on my turn. So good card. It's not one that's going to be super flashy, where it's like, oh, you're moving 6 threat at once or 7 threat at once or whatever. But 3 threat for 1 and still having a whole turn ahead of you is really effective and can't be understated. Next up, we have the attack version of this, which is my personal favorite, Pot Shot. So this is a 2-cost event again, double the number of wild resources generated while paying for this card. Hero action, deal 4 damage to an enemy. So again, this is essentially 1 cost, deal 4 damage. I know it's not printed that way, but I never once used it for its 2 cost. You shouldn't either. And when you look at it as 1 cost, deal 4 damage with the potential to do this and the threat version on this turn, 2 pot shots on the same turn, you could have used, I'm always forgetting the names of these cards. Not Lightspeed Flight. Why can't I find the card I want to talk about? Forcefield Projection. I put them on the table wrong. Forcefield Projection. If you wanted to defend and then still be able to do stuff on your next turn, again, because these all cost 1 if you're using the wild resources, Forcefield just does naturally. You should be able to do everything you want to do. That's one of the things that Nova's really strong with, is that these cards are all really inexpensive. So it's not like you're deciding, am I going to do this turn, or am I going to do this turn? You're kind of just doing it all. Every turn feels really full of a bunch of different actions. And it feels great because of that when you have 2 pot shots in your hand, or when you have 2 Lightspeed Flights in your hand, because it really usually does mean that it's going to be you're removing 6 threat for 2, or you're doing 8 damage for 2, because you can reliably find a way to always generate 2 wild resources, which is just do that with the helmet, ready, and then do it with the helmet again. You always kind of have 2 wild resources at your disposal. And obviously there's gonna be moments where you've had a really bad game, your upgrade's been discarded, you don't have a way to get it back yet, you haven't been able to go alter ego. This isn't universal. There's gonna be those times where you're in a bad situation. But in general, that's kind of what you're getting done with Nova, and that feels really good. And you have these really efficient turns where you're using most of the cards in your hand. All right, another one-cost event. This is Unleash Nova Force. Max 1 per round. Hero action until the end of the round. Each time Nova defeats an enemy or removes the last threat from a scheme, ready Nova and draw 1 card. This is a really, really good card. Again, you have all these really cheap, efficient ways to remove 3 threat, to deal 4 damage, to use multiple basic attacks and thwarts as well. So you're likely going to be able to have this trigger multiple times, or at least once, pretty reliably, and this doesn't cost very much to use either. So on top of that, being able to ready Nova again, which is going to get you another use out of your Supernova Helmet, and just another base use out of Nova if you've built him up, and you're drawing a card on top of that to facilitate getting more turns and having more cards to pay for all this stuff. The turns that I used Unleash Force, Nova Force, were massive turns, and I guess I don't mean massive like I've done 20 damage or anything, but it just feels like I got a lot done in the same way that sometimes Quicksilver can feel like he gets so much done by readying and using himself over and over and over again. It kind of felt that way. I was getting like 3 uses out of Nova, like basic attacks, or 2 basic attacks or thwarts out of Nova. On top of that, I'm getting like 3 uses out of the helmet, which is allowing me to pay for things like Pot Shot and the one that removes threats and everything. Sometimes I have multiple copies of those in my hand. Sometimes this draws me a card that I'm then able to play. It's going to facilitate you just feeling like you have these really action-packed turns, which is really exciting. So really key card in your deck, and one I think you'll probably use a lot and have a lot of fun with. Then we've got Connection to the Worldmind. This is another super important card because it is simply a resource card that generates a wild resource, and you have 2 of them. So 2 more reliable ways to get wild resources. And on top of that, honestly, they probably could have just printed this as it generates a wild resource with no ability, and in this deck specifically, it would have been good enough. But on top of that, they give you the ability that Connection to the Worldmind does not count towards your hand size, which means that this is basically an extra spot in your hand that this takes up that is just for the fact that it can generate a wild resource. So it allows you to have extra cards in your hand to be able to do stuff, but you still have access to these wild resources to be able to pay for stuff. So awesome card. One of my sleeper favorites in this deck because it's not super flashy, you're not doing a whole bunch of damage with it, but man, does it facilitate a whole bunch of stuff by not counting towards your hand size and giving you extra ways to get these reliable and really important wild resources. Then we got finally Jesse Alexander. This is a 2-cost support, Persona, Alter Ego action, exhaust Jesse Alexander, shuffle 1 copy of Connection to the Worldmind from your discard pile into your deck and draw 1 card. Really interesting card. I love cards that specifically target a named other card, like they work in conjunction, and the fact that I just said how important these resource cards and these extra ways to have wild resources are, the fact that you get to shuffle that back into your deck frequently so you always have access to them, and you're drawing a card on top of that, which you might draw into that, you might draw into something else. Really strong support card. Getting this out early in the game means you're even going to have an easier time having access to wild resources, which means it's just going to facilitate a whole bunch of other stuff you're doing. Really neat support card, and I like the way it ties into that specific resource card and getting that into your deck a little bit more often. Okay, this is an aggression deck. We're going to get into the aggression cards now, and we're going to start, of course, with the aggression ally, the brand new one called the Locust. This is another 2-cost ally, 2 health, 1 thwart, 1 attack, 2 consequential damage on that 1 thwart, though, which obviously the stat line seems pretty weak. It is a champion, and it can only be played if your identity has the champion trait, so we got to hope the ability is pretty strong here. The ability is hero response after the Locust enters play, add 1 aggression event, red event from your discard pile directly to your hand. So essentially you can almost look at this as, instead of drawing a card, you're tutoring an exact card you want from your discard pile within the parameters here, within the restriction of it being an aggression event. So obviously, depending on the deck you're playing, depending when you're playing the Locust, that could be a worse version of draw a card, or it could be a much better version of draw a card, especially if you play the Locust after most of your deck's been discarded, or even just like your important cards have been discarded from the aggression. Then you're essentially grabbing your most important aggression event that you have in your deck, the targets that you've specifically put in there because you've built a deck with the Locust in it. You're grabbing them, getting them directly into your hand, and potentially being able to play them this turn because the Locust is pretty inexpensive, and you have access to the Worldmind card we just talked about and the helmet to get extra resource to pay for stuff. So you're able to potentially play that card this turn. Perhaps you already did, maybe you did play it this turn, you played the Locust to get it back, maybe you're playing it again, or now you have it in your hand for next turn. So Locust is really good, but it is ever so slightly situational in that obviously obviously the time of the game you play it at is going to determine the power level. If you don't play at the right time, it's a really weak stat line for 2, even if it is a chump blocker, and you might feel like, this wasn't really worth the hassle to play it. So not that there's that much hassle, it's cheap, but you know what I mean. So yeah, could be a really good card, and the times I used it, getting back, the next card we're going to look at specifically was where I had the most success with it and felt really good. But in general, it's going to just depend what you're grabbing. So I teased it a little bit. That being said, the next card is 3 copies of Pitchback. This is a 1-cost aggression event. Play only if your identity has the aerial trait, which remember, the Supernova Helmet does give you aerial, which obviously is super important for this. After your hero attacks, deal 4 damage to an enemy. So it's essentially 1 cost, deal 4 damage, which is exactly what Nova's hero card there can do as well, just by using a wild resource. But this one is after your hero attacks. So the only condition here that you have to really worry about besides aerial, which you should have if you have the helmet, is that you're only utilizing this specifically after you've exhausted Nova to use one of the abilities, which you're going to be doing a lot anyways to ready your helmet. Pitchback was honestly one of the, I don't even want to say a sleeper hit. It was the hit of most of the games I played. It ended up being the card that was doing the most damage, that was going the distance in every game that I played, constantly being used, constantly bringing it back with the Locust, and just any other way I could to be able to use this more, because for 1 cost to do 4 damage, if I have 2 of them in my hand, again, doing 8 damage for 2 across these cards, and then potentially doing another 4 damage or 8 damage with Nova's hero cards that are basically the same thing and just need to use wild resources. When you have access to all these additional ways to get wild resources that don't clog up your hand, that don't slow you down, you can get a lot of damage done, but this one is spread across multiple cards instead of it being a single big hitter card. I liked this style of play. It was really fun, and cards like Pitchback just really work well in conjunction with the Locust and that are meant to get cards back, because it's a cheap, effective way to do that. Next, we've got No Quarter. This is a 2-cost event that has a requirement of using 1 strength resource. Hero action attack, deal 4 damage to an enemy, obviously for 2. For each point of excess damage dealt to that enemy by this attack, discard the top card of your deck and add each aggression card discarded this way to your hand. Interesting card that I have to say, and this obviously it could be just bad luck of the draw, but in my personal experience, there was so many times that I didn't hit enough aggression events, or any aggression events, or ones I really wanted, that it never felt worth it to discard the other cards I was losing that sometimes were really key cards for my hero cards that I wanted, or other cards in general that I wanted, just for the chance to get into like Pitchback or 1x1 that we're going to look at, or whatever the case may be. I think you really would have had to have built a really strong aggression deck, one that has your key cards and your really important cards being the aggression cards, that it's worth the risk of losing access to the other cards you're discarding to be able to, draw into the ones you want. And on top of that, you have to have a reliable way to do that overkill, excess damage, to be able to draw more and hopefully get more from that. So, situational card. I personally didn't enjoy this card as much as I was hoping when I first looked into it or read about it, but again, that could have just been my bad luck. I'm sure it's also I'm basing this off the deck that was pre-built. If you built your deck a certain way, it could be really successful. Then we've got 1x1. This is another 1-cost aggression event. Hero action, deal 2 damage to an enemy. If this attack defeats that enemy, deal 2 damage to an enemy again. I like this card. It's essentially Pitchback, but split. You can either you can do it exactly like Pitchback, so it's essentially 1 cost, do 4 damage with just a different condition, and it's split. Or I guess in either way it's split. I'm thinking you can do 4 damage to the same target, but either way you have to defeat the first one. So forget what I said. This is Pitchback, but split across 2 targets. So specifically, I think this is better if you have a hero that you're taking on, or a villain you're taking on, I should say, that it has a bunch of minions or smaller minions that you're going to be wanting to deal with. The fact that you can potentially pick off 2 minions that are pesky and small for 1 cost is a huge deal. That's where I had the most success with it, with just having a small minion that has guard in play, that's its primary function, or one that's really pesky but only has 1 health. Just being able to say, okay, I'm going to use 1x1, kill this one, and then because that dies, kill this one as well for 1 cost and still get a whole bunch out of my turn. There's oftentimes with heroes that even with these low cost minions, you have to say, okay, I'm going to use the basic attack, then I'm going to use this card that's going to be overkill to kill this minion, but I just want to get rid of it. It's an inefficient way to deal with them. I feel like 1x1 is the type of card you're going to put into a deck when you're going into a scenario that has a lot of these small minions that you don't want to waste resources or time trying to take out, and you just use 1x1 to sort of clear them out of the way so you can actually use your better cards on the villain and some of the bigger minions that you run into. Then we've got Fluid Motion, 1 cost upgrade. Hero response: after you play an attack event, exhaust this card, your hero gets +1 attack until the end of the phase, max 1 per attack event that you can use. You can't use more than 1 Fluid Motion on an attack event. I really enjoyed this card. It's not, uber powerful or anything, but specifically being able to power up Nova's pretty low stat line when he has ways to ready with other cards, and where you want to constantly be using his basic powers to get the helmet refreshed. Anything you can do to power up your base stats is just going to get you extra damage or extra threat removal on top of everything else you're trying to do. So having this out there, and the fact that you're almost always going to be doing attack events, at least in this pre-built deck, means that you're going to be able to hit this a lot. You don't have to discard this when you use the ability. If you get this out early, you can use this every turn for the entire game if it stays in play. That adds up. You eventually get a whole bunch of extra damage going through. So again, I think it really depends when you get it. There's 3 copies of it. You should hopefully see it early. And you can, again, have multiple in play. You just can't use them both for the same attack event. Again, think about it. With Nova, you're also using really small attack events. So if you have multiples of these in play, you could use one on the first attack event, use the next one on the next attack event, and now you've boosted Nova's damage output by 2 before you use his basic attack that then refreshes your helmet. There's a lot of comboing that you can do. If you almost just have to figure out the puzzle of the order you want to go in. But other than that, it's a really good facilitator card for a lot of other stuff you're going to be doing. All right, and the last aggression card is Honed Technique, a 3 cost upgrade and a more expensive one with a requirement of 2 mind resources. Max 1 per player. When you play an aggression attack event, if you paid for that event using a mind resource, increase the amount of damage that event deals by its printed cost. This is a really interesting card that feels like misplaced in this deck, kind of. I get why you'd want in this deck because well, no, I don't, because it's an aggression attack event. I was going to say with some of Nova's cards, you could be paying 1, but the printed cost is 2. But those aren't aggression attack events. So I feel like the other attack events that are in here are, not expensive ones, and so you're getting an additional 2 damage, whatever the cost may be. I feel like this isn't the deck you necessarily want this card in, but this does make for a really interesting idea of building a deck around having, aggression events that get boosted by this card to deal all this extra damage, ones that cost 2 or more essentially, that you're able to get a whole bunch more out of it than you probably should, as long as you're able to meet this requirement of the mind resources. I honestly did not use this very much in the games I played. I obviously use the base deck when I'm playtesting. I think there was one game I got it out and it hit once or twice, and I got a little bit of extra damage out of it, but nothing that ever made me feel like, oh, I love this card or anything. So it is one of the the lesser interesting cards to me in this deck, but the potential to me is interesting for the deck building that people are going to come up with to utilize this and make it a little bit more exciting. All right, got a new basic ally. This is Moon Girl. Play only if your identity has the champion or genius trait. It's one of the 2. I didn't even read the stat line, so that you already get a little tease of the ability. 3 cost, 3 health, 2 thwart, and 2 attack, and both of them have 2 consequential damage. So again, play only if your identity has the champion or genius trait. After you play Moon Girl from your hand, draw 1 card for each mind resource you use to pay for her. This has the potential to be pretty wild. The fact that if you are playing this in the right type of deck and you have access to a bunch of mind resources, or again, Nova specifically with the wild resource, being able to just sort of make that be whatever you want it to be, if you can use all 3 resources as mind resource, you're drawing 3 cards. You're paying for her to get an ally into play with 3 health, replacing all 3 cards that you just paid for her with, essentially making her free, and you can get the 2 attack, 2 thwart out of her, and get a block out of her as well. I mean, that is ridiculously good. That would, if that alone, if that didn't have the requirement, that was just always happening, it would be the most broken ally in the game in terms of reliability. So the fact that that has that potential, and you can kind of deck build or use Nova specifically to be able to hit that requirement more often, it makes Moon Girl one of those cards where normally you have to you're kind of juggling the idea when you look at your hand with some of these more expensive allies of, do I want to play this ally and not do much else or anything else with my turn, or am I willing to sacrifice this ally to do some other stuff but not have that ally and that protection in play? Moon Girl lets you have your cake and eat it too, because you play her if you have the mind resources, that, especially for all 3, and then you get all your cards back to use the player, and you basically get a brand new turn, or a brand new turn with some new cards in your hand. Half your hand is new cards, and you get an ally in play that's actually pretty good. So really powerful card. Again, you just really have to deck build around Moon Girl, but if you do, I think it's going to be an absolute MVP in the deck that you're playing. And we got 3 copies of Everyday Hero. This is a resource card that also generates a wild resource, which is, again, super important for Nova. While your identity has the civilian trait, this card can be spent for any player and gains the text response. After you spend this card for a player, heal 1 damage from that player's identity. I was playing solo two-handed, and I was able to use this, I think, a couple times to essentially help pay for something that was being played by Ironheart, which is honestly the coolest thing about this card. But the fact is, it's also a wild resource, which means that for Nova specifically, as much as that's a cool little effect, it just being a card that generates a wild resource sometimes is good enough in Nova that it doesn't even matter that it could be played for other players. I do love that that's on there, because I think that having more cards that specifically reward you for playing multiplayer, and now it has this more extra cooperative element where I can help you pay for cards using my hand if I think I'm going to be okay with paying for stuff with my cards. I just like that element. I think it adds some cool cooperation and strategy in there. And again, after you spend this card for a player, heal 1 damage from that player's identity. Something small, but again, that's just sort of the added little bonus on top of being able to, share the resource with someone else, and it's a wild resource. And then finally, we have Champion's Mobile Bunker. 2-cost support. Hero action, exhaust Champion's Mobile Bunker. Choose an identity with the champion trait. The player who controls that identity may draw 2 cards, then discard 2 cards from their hand. This card got a lot of mileage for me. It was not too expensive to put out compared to, like, say, Avengers Mansion, where sometimes you have to, use your entire turn to do it. And yes, you're drawing 2 and discarding 2, so you're staying at the same hand size, but this really just helps if you're in a situation where, you're going to have cards left over in your hand, and they're going to go to waste, and you're going to be discarding them, and you're thinking, well, I wish I had other cards in my hand, or I wish I had 1 card that was different, or I wish I need a wild resource, I don't have one in my hand. Drawing up those 2 cards usually will get you something that you can use. At least for me, it usually got me something or changed my strategy ever so slightly. And even if it didn't, it's not that much of a detriment that you've gone through an extra couple cards in your deck. If that's constantly happening, maybe that is a bigger problem. But for me, I actually really enjoyed the card and what it brought to the table, and the flexibility with drawing into extra cards to see what I can do with them. Okay, we're going into the obligation, which is Weight of the World. This says, give to the Sam Alexander player, while this card is in play, Supernova Helmet cannot ready. Alter ego action, exhaust Sam Alexander, remove this obligation from the game. So, really nasty obligation. Your helmet being inaccessible sucks. There's no way it can unexhaust, and that is that it can ready, and that is one of the key things that's keeping you going and constantly having access to wild resources for what all the cards you're wanting to pay for. If you happen to have a hand that has a bunch of wild resources in it, or other ways to generate them, maybe you can go a couple turns without having to worry about this card and slow yourself down. Otherwise, it's not at all that hard to get rid of. I think you're just gonna either immediately go to Alter Ego to get rid of it, or you're gonna wait till the next time you're planning to go to Alter Ego, and all you're doing is exhausting Sam Alexander. You can do that the turn you flip. You can do it at the start of your next turn before you go to hero form. There are other ways to ready Nova afterwards. So it honestly is not that hard to deal with as an obligation. So even though it's nasty, the initial effect, you'll probably overcome it pretty easily. All right, then we got the Nemesis, Warbringer. 1 scheme, 3 attack, 5 health. The force interrupt on the attack. When Warbringer attacks you, he gets +1 attack for that attack for each card with a printed wild resource in your hand, and that attack gains overkill. So a card specifically just meant to punish you for being as effective with Nova as you can. If you have a hand that you just happen to have a bunch of wild resources and you're really set up for the next turn, this is going to punish you for that. If you have a couple Worldminds in your hand or Everyday Heroes, suddenly you might be dealing with an attack of 5 or 6 coming your way that it has overkill on top of that, so you can't even properly block that with your allies. Nasty minion, or nasty Nemesis minion, has 5 health, not going to necessarily always be taken out with a single hit or anything. I think in terms of Nemesis minions, one of the nastier ones we've seen, because it's specifically targeting and punishing you for something you want to be doing, which is kind of what they always do, but this one does it in a really effective way. So yeah, definitely watch out for Warbringer, not fun. Then we got Bring the War. Side scheme, when revealed, each player discards 1 card they control with a printed wild resource. For each card discarded this way, place 1 threat here. So it starts with 2 threat. You're going to get some extra ones on there. It has the hazard icon to get you an extra encounter card. And you're likely going to have something in your hand that's a wild resource. And not only is that causing you to add threat here, which is making it harder to get rid of the extra encounter card, you're losing that wild resource card that you probably were wanting to use, likely, on something that requires it. So also a nasty card. This and Warbringer together are 2 cards that just make Nova's life extra difficult. But again, they're both punishing in the right ways that I love the design from a Nemesis and side scheme perspective. Then we've got 2 copies of War Delivery Treachery. When revealed, you may spend a wild resource. If you do not, the villain and Warbringer each attack you, even if you are in alter ego form. So you can spend a wild resource, essentially discard one from your hand or use the Supernova Helmet or whatever the case may be to negate this. But if you don't, you're getting attacked by the villain, by a Warbringer, and it does not matter if you're an alter ego. That is a situation, depending on the villain and depending on what Warbringer is going to boost his attack to, you could end up drawing this and having this lose you the game. These are the type of treacheries that, you'll be in that situation where you got like 5 health left or 4 health left, and you think, okay, I can win next turn as long as I don't draw into a really nasty card. This War Delivery is one of those cards you're hoping not to draw unless you have the wild resource, and even then it might slow down what you were planning to do. So I think in general you're probably going to spend the wild resource. If you're not, you're honestly like ready to take those hits, or maybe Warbringer's on play and the villain doesn't attack for a lot, but the potential is there for it to be really, really powerful. The next is the Treachery, The War's Been Brought. This card just says Surge right off the bat, so it's going to surge into something else. When revealed, discard X cards from the top of the encounter deck, where X is equal to the total number of printed wild resources on cards in your hand, cards you control, and cards in the discard pile. So this is just a way to cycle through the encounter deck quicker. It's going to surge into something else, and you're just going to discard a bunch of cards off the top, which is obviously going to go through the deck a little bit quicker, and you're trying to avoid that. So nothing, too over the top there, but obviously if you're worried about going through the deck, this is a card that's going to, make that a little bit tougher. All right, time to get some extra player cards, and like we talked about with Ironheart specifically gave us some key new champion allies to boost up your champion archetype. Nova's cards specifically hone in on the aerial trait, which is something I even mentioned in the preview, saying, when cards have these ways to gain aerial, I always hope that there's more cards that benefit from aerial. They listened, and they gave us 3 copies of a Justice card and 3 copies of a Protection card that specifically boost you from having the aerial trait, which means that if you're going to play Nova in Justice or Protection, even though you're losing access to the aggression one, you're going to have other cards that will benefit from him gaining aerial. I love that inclusion. First one is Yaw and Roll, 1 cost event, Justice. Play only if your identity has the aerial trait. Hero response: after your hero thwarts, remove 3 threat from a scheme. So after you thwart for his base 1 or whatever you've gotten it to, you're going to get an additional 3 threat removed for just 1 cost because he has aerial. Not a whole lot more to say about that. It's good. It's it's not fantastic or anything, but if you're playing the hero that is meant to, if you're playing Justice and especially if you're playing multiplayer and your role is to take care of the threat and keep that under control, this is a really cheap, effective way to do that. And we know that Nova loves these really cheap cards that they can play a bunch of on that turn. So really good addition to your Justice builds for sure. And then we've got Height Advantage, 1 cost upgrade, Protection. While your identity has the aerial trait, reduce the amount of damage you take from each enemy attack by 1. Force interrupt when your turn begins, discard this card. Interesting card. Basically, it's only out there for that turn. You're playing it for cheap, and when your next turn starts, it goes away. So you are specifically having to play this and choose to play it when you think you're entering a villain phase that you really need to mitigate damage. I don't think you're necessarily playing this if all you're expecting to take is a single villain hit. If the villain's attacking you for 3 next turn, I don't think that this is going to be your goal to play this card, because yes, you might prevent 1, and sure, it might just be that 1 damage would have been the one that kills you, but in general, it's probably not going to be always worth it just to say I might prevent 1 damage only for 1. I think you're playing this when you're expecting to get a bunch of hits from a bunch of little pesky minions, maybe ones that only deal 1 damage, and rather than have to say, okay, I'm going to go to alter ego form so I don't have to take these hits, and I guess I'll just have to deal with the threat, you're able to just say, I'm going to take these hits and basically tank them this turn, have it all mitigated with this card, and then it'll go away and I'll do something else. So cool potential is there, and I think in the right scenario, you're dealing with a bunch of Ultron bots or whatever, I think it could be really, really powerful. Okay, lastly, we're going to quickly go through the Armadillo encounter set, which we'll start with the Minion Armadillo. Everything's built around him. 1 scheme, 2 attack, 8 health. Toughness: Armadillo can have any number of tough status cards, a huge deal. Force response: after Armadillo activates against you, give him a tough status card. So everything about this is just loading Armadillo up with a bunch of tough status cards, which makes it really hard to get them off of him to be able to go actually do damage to Armadillo. And he's got 8 health, which means he's not going to go down very easily either. This is going to be one of those pesky minions that you're like, okay, well, I would love to deal with him this turn, but I've got to get 3 attacks in first to get rid of these 3 tough status cards. By the time I'm done that, I can't even do any big damage, or I can do a little bit of damage and then he's going to gain them back. This is going to be a really, really annoying card for a lot of people to deal with, I think. I'm interested to see what scenarios they can go into, just sort of power up those scenarios and make them really, really extra difficult. Then we've got the side scheme, which is Armored Assault. 3 threat per player on this to start off. Each enemy with a tough status card gets +3 attack. Crazy nasty. Because he's almost always going to, at some point in the game, have a tough status card, it turns that 2 attack into 5 attack coming your way, on top of having 8 health. On top of having tough status cards, then you now have extra incentive to get rid of, and then you almost have to like decide, do I focus on getting rid of those tough status cards so that this doesn't come into play, and even though he's going to eventually get them back, and then I can attack him? Or do I, spend my time getting rid of this card specifically just so I can mitigate that huge attack coming through? It's going to really split your resources and, make things extra difficult for you. Then we've got Rollin, an attachment that gives you +2 attack, or gives Armadillo +2 attack. Attached to Armadillo, if Armadillo is not in play, search the encounter deck and discard pile for Armadillo, put him into play, engage with you, and attach this to him. While Armadillo has a tough status card, characters cannot defend against his attack. This card sucks. Like, this is a horrible card in the best way possible. The fact that this attachment always goes on Armadillo, and if he's not in play, you tutor him into play, he becomes like engaged with you in play, gets +2 attack, and you can't defend against his attacks. Potentially if that side scheme's in play, you're also getting +3 attack there. Armadillo is a really, really nasty minion with all these complementary cards, and Rollin almost has no downsides for him. Like, normally these type of cards, it's like, if this Nemesis in play, attach to them, if not, Surge, which is, you can deal with that. This one just gets you this annoying minion, puts into play, which means you're probably going to be seeing a lot of Armadillo, even if you don't want to. Then we got Tough and Tumble, a treachery card. When revealed in Alter Ego, each enemy with a tough status card schemes. If no enemy activate this way, gain Surge. When revealed in Hero, each enemy with a tough status card attacks you. If no enemy activate this way, gain Surge. So as long as Armadillo has a tough status card, you're getting either attacked or schemed against an additional time by Armadillo. Again, not fun, especially if his attack's been powered up. If he schemes, honestly not as big of a deal based on his stat line. I think the attack is where it's going to really suck. And then lastly, we got 2 copies of the Treachery, Tough It Out. When revealed, give Armadillo and the villain each a tough status card. If 1 or fewer tough status cards were given this way, this card gains Surge. Again, any way that adds tough status cards onto Armadillo, additional ones, is going to suck, because it's going to make it harder for us to deal with him, and it's going to power him up in potentially other ways, like giving him +3 attack and whatnot. The fact that if it only hits 1 target as well, like say Armadillo is not in play and it just gives the villain 1, it surges into something else. Giving a tough status card to the villain sucks as well, and on top of that, surging into something else seems like just a little bit of an overpowered treachery for you to deal with. So nasty card all around. Honestly, that entire counter set's pretty nasty. So if you're looking for a way to sort of make an encounter a little bit more difficult, I think a good option is now just inserting Armadillo, because it's going to give you a whole bunch of trouble. That is Nova. So what do I think of Nova? I enjoy Nova. I'll say that right off the bat. I don't want to give any misconceptions before I say this next part. I do enjoy playing Nova, and it was a lot of fun in a different kind of style. I will say that out of Ironheart and Nova, I liked Ironheart a lot more than Nova, so it kind of made my response to Nova feel a little bit more lukewarm than I think was fair. Nova is a lot of fun. You just have to kind of, the playstyle you're coming in with, that you're okay with kind of thing if you're coming into Nova, is he's playing a lot of really cheap small cards, like boom, 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 rather than, trying to afford the big 4-cost and 3-cost cards. At least in this base deck, his entire, motto operandum or whatever is, I'm going to play a bunch of 1-cost attack cards or 1-cost thwart cards, and try to, spend all these wild resources I have with my Supernova Helmet that's in play to get me extra turns, the Worldmind, to be able to not have that take a slot in my hand and be able to afford more stuff. Maybe I'm playing 4 or 5 1-cost cards in my turn if I can figure out a way to do that, or maybe 5 is ridiculous. But, it's possible with all these resources that you can generate. So if that sounds really interesting to you, if that sounds fun, I think you're really going to enjoy Nova. And the fact that they give you the additional aerial cards means that, you're not punished by playing with another aspect where all of a sudden it's like, well, this aerial, it's cool that he gets aerial, but it does nothing. There's now more options to have aerial work in your favor, and we have the ones that are obviously released in the past as well. So lots of cool stuff. I do enjoy Nova. It's not, I don't think Nova's as powerful as Ironheart. I don't think I'll enjoy Nova at any point more than I do Ironheart, but those are my guesses. It's hard to say. The game is constantly evolving. We could end up having some crazy decks come out that make Nova unbelievably powerful and some sort of S tier hero. But as of right now, I prefer Ironheart more than Nova, but still a really fun pack. And honestly, they're different enough that it's nice that they release at the same time, because playing them in conjunction with each other at two-handed solo was a whole ton of fun. I love both of them. that is Nova. Thank you so much for watching. These are the Marvel Champions videos for May. We won't be getting any new hero packs until July, I believe. I believe we're getting the next two at that point, and I'm sure we'll get some sort of announcement in June, you know, a preview or something like that. So there's likely will still be a Marvel Champions video at some point in June, but the next reviews will be in July. So thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.